1,000,000 yen to move out. Facing a demographic crisis, Japan is incentivizing people to leave Tokyo. But are they offering enough to lure young families into stagnant rural areas? And will it really help an aging population and overcrowded cities? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Japan. Well, Japan is dealing with some serious demographic challenges. So in an attempt to combat depopulation in areas outside the capital, the government is offering a financial incentive. It's been tried before, but the payments for those willing to leave Tokyo now have more than tripled. Japan has a severe labor shortage and an aging population. The ratio of retirees to young people is rapidly increasing, with people spending more of their lives drawing on public funds, making government social security unsustainable. Young people are moving away from rural areas for opportunities in the cities, leaving behind millions of unoccupied homes, forcing schools and hospitals to close. If this migration trend continues, 896 municipalities could simply vanish by 2040. So the government is offering people money to repopulate those areas. A move to the countryside will now earn you $7,700 per child, 18 and under, plus more for the actual move. It's the latest offering in a plan that started back in 2019, but is it enough to reverse the trend?
Japan is facing a demographic disaster. It now has the world's oldest population and a rapidly decreasing birth rate, putting one of the world's largest economies in a serious dilemma. 11% of the population is 15 years old or younger, meaning there will be fewer people entering the Japanese workforce in the coming decades. Meanwhile, people aged 65 and older make up nearly 30% of the population. And with healthy habits and advanced healthcare, Japan's average life expectancy is increasing. The median age is 48.7, almost 20 years higher than the global median. On top of that, there aren't enough babies being born to sustain the population. That's true of many developed nations, but most counter it by encouraging immigration. Not so in Japan. The declining population isn't the only demographic problem facing the land of the rising sun. There's also internal migration. Japan's younger people are flocking to the cities, including megacities like Tokyo and Osaka, in search of higher earnings and better education. Almost 30% of the Japanese population now lives in Greater Tokyo, with tens of thousands of people moving there each year. In an effort to combat this, the government is offering incentives to breathe new life into deserted rural areas. Families with children 18 years and younger can pocket a one-off payment of 1,000,000 yen, around $7,500, per child to move out of the city, on top of a flat 1,000,000 yen moving fee. But of course, there are conditions. At least one earner in each household must either find a job or set up a business. And the family must stay there for a minimum of 5 years. If they don't, they must repay the whole amount. This kind of policy is nothing new. Incentives have been available since 2019, but fewer than 1,500 families took them up. Now the government has sweetened the deal, hoping to attract more takers.
Joining me now to debate whether the Japanese government is on the right track with its latest attempt to change the demographics are from Washington. Deputy Director of the Asia Program at the Wilson Center, Shihoko Goto. From Hokkaido, Associate Professor at Hokkaido University and author of Urban Migrants in Rural Japan, Susanne Klien. And from Tokyo, Vice News journalist Hanako Montgomery. Thanks all so much for being with us. Shihoko, let me just start with you. Is this going to work?
Let's put it this way. If the end goal is for revitalization of the rural communities and also to improve the demographic right now, which is really skewed towards an elderly population, then this is a step in the right direction. But of course, there's going to be a lot of holistic and strategic investment in the communities. So it's not enough. You really need to ensure that people are motivated to not just move, but also to stay And that's not that's going to take a longer term strategic investment on the part of the government and as well as on the rural communities as well.
Quickly, which model or models is Tokyo even looking at, if they are, to make this work? We know Ireland, Italy, and Spain are among others that have incentivized people to move out of crowded cities, via work from home or property investment schemes. But Japan seems to be after something different. I mean, they want an entire shift in their population, do they not?
Yes, they do. So there are two issues at stake right now. One is the fact that Japan is the graying society. It is the most elderly population in the world. But that said, this is a phenomenon that's shared by all industrialized countries. Italy, France, these are all countries that are facing a similar challenge. So I think this is why your show and other media organizations and other governments indeed are looking at how Japan is dealing with this, because although this is something that the Japanese are trying to deal with, other countries want to follow suit as well. And so when we look out also from the regional, provincial government challenges as well, they are competing amongst themselves to attract people to, and so there is going to be domestic competition as well.
Right. It's such a complicated dynamic, really. Let me turn to Susanne, because you have very closely studied urban migrants in Japan. I mean, do you think the government is looking at this in the right way by trying to make these financial incentives, or there's something, a lot more to the equation that they haven't factored in?
Yes, I think that it's not really about money only. I think there's lots of other factors that need to be considered, as we've already heard before. Life in the countryside is, of course, cheaper than in cities, but there's other things that do cost money in the countryside. Usually you need to have a car, as there is no public transport. And there's lots of things you can't actually buy with money. You need to obtain social capital, establish social relations with people. So I think there's a lot of other support required for people who are planning to move or even interested in moving. Statistics show that more and more people are interested, but they find it difficult to implement the moves. I think.
Why do you think? I mean, is the government considering all these other angles? I mean, for example, how much are they looking at luring bigger industries to areas outside the cities? Because people are there. I know they're asking people to kind of drive this entrepreneurial spirit, start your own businesses in some of these more stagnant areas. But it often doesn't work that way. People will go somewhere if they have a job. Are they trying to get industry to move the jobs outside the cities?
Yeah, absolutely. There's quite a lot of financial incentives for companies to, for example, establish satellite offices. So, in fact, quite a few IT companies already started kind of establishing satellite offices back in 2017 when I was doing field work. So back then, I actually talked to a couple of employees who had been dispatched from Tokyo to some rural areas, and they were not so enthusiastic about this. But now, when I went back 4 years later, they actually were still there, saying that they've actually started enjoying rural life. So times do change.
Well, that must be encouraging for the government. Hanako, during the pandemic, it was pretty much straightforward for people to go out to more rural areas. You could get the space that everyone wanted, the fresh air. Is any of that lure still there?
Yes, I think it really depends. It's a case-by-case situation, right? So if, for instance, a family has parents, right, who are working remotely from Tokyo, then perhaps they have the freedom to move into a rural area and continue their job in Tokyo. But during the pandemic, we didn't see, a huge number of companies shutting down their offices and letting everyone remote work. There were still people who had to go into the office and work. So for those families, it's very difficult to just kind of pick up their lives and move to a rural area because of this one-time cash incentive. And now that things are going back to normal, so to speak, where we're seeing less people wearing masks and people feeling a little bit more comfortable about going out, there might be even less incentive to move to a rural area where there's a lot of green and less people, perhaps.
Right. And, it's difficult, Hanako, for a city like Tokyo, because another incentive for people to leave big cities is, they don't want the crime rates. They want somewhere cleaner. But Tokyo is an incredibly safe city. It's also incredibly clean. It doesn't have those negative city factors that other cities in the United States, for example, might have to drive people out to the suburbs.
Sure. Yes, yeah, that's definitely one way of looking at it. Tokyo is known for being a huge city, especially if you look at Greater Tokyo, right? It's around 37 million people. That includes Saitama, Chiba, Kanagawa. And when you have 37 million people, right, that's around 30% of Japan's entire population. You have the safety element, you have fantastic public transportation. I grew up predominantly in New York City, where the trains never ran on time. So, catching a train in Tokyo that comes on time and actually tells me if it's 30 seconds or a minute late, it's wonderful. Of course, there are many other incentives to stay in Tokyo, for instance, job prospects for families with kids in university. It might be also higher education, lots of different factors to consider if you're remaining in the capital.
I mean, do you think Tokyo or Japan really could benefit from maybe trying to mimic better the American suburban dream, whereby you can still be within reach of a city, but having that quiet, that space, more of a community with bigger homes? Japan doesn't so much have that dynamic. Could that be built?
Yeah, so I think, at the moment, a Japanese think tank called the Japan Policy Council said that if this trend of depopulation and this aging society continues in Japan, 896 municipalities, right, so around 900, nearly half of Japan's total could vanish by 2040. So clearly this is a pressing issue. And one suggestion to kind of resolve this issue, to encourage more people to move out into the suburbs and, not be so concentrated in the Greater Tokyo area, has been to perhaps mimic other Tokyos. Osaka, right, the Kansai region, that's quite popular, Fukuoka as well. Those aren't necessarily suburbs, but they're smaller cities. And I believe, as was discussed a little bit earlier, companies have been encouraged to move there, perhaps given, some cash incentives or just kind of different job prospects as well for families.
Right. Shihoko, yes, Tokyo is kind of desperately overcrowded, but at the same time, the government still wants to increase the birth rate. Is there a way now to have it both ways?
Right. So there are two goals, right? So you want to move away from the capital and ease the burden on the capital and revitalize communities outside of the capital as well. And the other issue is about dealing with the demographic challenge, which is not just dealing with the graying society, but incentivizing people to have more children. And so that's also had a cash incentive as well. So you have tax breaks, you have child care credit. These are things that here in the United States, as a mother, I would like that very much. But that isn't really incentivizing people to have more children. So if they moved outside of Tokyo, would that make it easier? Would childcare be easier? Definitely, in terms of being able to travel with your children, go to a daycare. These kinds of things would be possible, yes. But again, you have to really motivate people to move and to want to stay, and then establish roots and feel comfortable enough so that they want to have children. And so if you're just incentivizing them with a cash offer, they're not necessarily going to have roots. They might telecommute for their company for a little while, work for a satellite office, but are they going to feel confident to build those roots? And that root establishment is really going to be the challenge here.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, Susanne, in the quest to build a younger demographic in Japan, I mean, if we look at countries that are not densely populated, Sweden and Denmark, for example, you actually see how successful they are as far as their economies running and managing their demographics. So should it really in Japan be about needing more people? And if it is about that, why not just allow for more immigration?
Yeah, immigration would definitely be one approach, but I think we can just scale down a little bit, as some towns have already accepted as an option. Talking about creative depopulation, for example, as Kamiyama Town does. So accepting that this is just the flow of events and eternal growth is just perhaps not natural
Yeah.
in these days.
Describe that. What is this creative depopulation?
So it's really the town's conscious attempt to accept that they cannot attract more and more people, but it's trying to go with very highly qualified people of all sorts and create a small, compact town that offers the benefits of the countryside and creative people that can meet face to face. So I think just bringing the best of both worlds together in a way.
Hanako, do you agree there? And I mean, fewer people can be a good thing if they are more productive. But Japan seems to want to have more people. Is that because they're looking at building their ethnically Japanese population in particular?
So I think in terms of its fertility rate, right? Looking at Japan's population, you see that it's a super senior society. And even the phrase that is being used in Japan to discuss its population crisis, shoushi-koreika, it's a combination of the fact that there aren't enough children and that it's an aging society. One way that was, discussed of kind of increasing the population by allowing foreigners to live in Japan more easily, right? That is a very simple solution, perhaps, at resolving Japan's population crisis. I think in Japan, roughly 2.2% of its entire population is foreign residents. In the US, it's 13%, right? So that would be a very simple way of resolving the issue. But I think with the Japanese government and with policies, simply relying on more people entering Japan might not always be the perfect fix. There might be some issues that they might not be able to predict. For instance, if not many people speak Japanese and don't feel the need or the desire to move to Japan, then what happens? So I think Japan is also trying to fix the problem from the inside out. But I definitely think allowing foreign residents, kind of clearing the way for them to live in Japan more easily, visas or even refugee applications as well, it's definitely something that the government should be considering.
Yeah. Shihoko, do you agree there?
I do in principle, but I do think there is no real political momentum. So there have been efforts by the Japanese government to attract the kind of people that they want. So there have been endeavors to have people who are highly skilled, that everyone in the world wants, that really highly educated IT, STEM types. But if they're really educated, they want to go elsewhere, right? So they would want to go to Australia, to Canada, to the United States, to Western Europe, all these other places. They're not necessarily motivated. Now, they also need other working people as well. So you have special visas that encourage people from Southeast Asia, for instance, Filipino nurses to come in and deal with the elderly population and caregiving and as well. But is there a political wave within Japan to say, yes, we need mass migration to deal with the depopulation challenge? That universally, politically, across the aisle is not really supported. And there are a couple of reasons why that is the case. But one of the biggest one is to say, well, look at how the United States is dealing with this population challenge by having more immigrants. Look at how Europe, France, and Britain, and all these countries are dealing with immigration. It's leading to social unrest. Japan is very homogenous, or so they say, except it's not. But there is this myth that Japan is homogenous, that it wants to continue to have and value this social stability, which leads to what you've described, the clean, safe Japan, and Tokyo in particular. migration, a change in the population dynamics would actually set that. And that's really the political and also the popular voice, which is really pushing back against this mass migration.
Right. Can I ask you as well, though, with this new plan in place, I mean, when you read it through, it really, so much of the incentives are about encouraging families to move. They're paying for children, your number of children. Let's be honest, I mean, there's a huge population of singles in Japan. It's a huge part of society, and that might not change very easily. Why aren't they incentivizing single people the same way?
Well, if you well, then they're trying to really fix the situation, kill a number of birds with a single stone, right? So dealing with the population challenge, dealing with the rural depopulation challenge as well. But I actually think that if you look at successful community revitalization, there are some successes that the government is actually not really highlighting. For instance, when we look at tourism, we look at places like Niseko in Hokkaido, we look at southern area in Naoshima. This is an island in southern Japan that was dealing with the depopulation challenge. What does the island do? It becomes a destination. People want to go there now. Why? Because it's become a vibrant modern art scene. So it's really the island itself has changed from people go there. People want to go there. They're dropping tourist dollars and yen there. There are ways, and that makes this island Naoshima very competitive compared to all the other rural, isolated islands, right? And so there are ways to ensure that there is an attractiveness, an allure of these particular destinations that would make it really attractive, not just for families, but for single artists, the creative types, and it would actually redefine Japan and Japan's own competitiveness as well.
Right. Make it a real appealing destination for a more diverse kind of group of people. You know, Susanne, if I can come back to you, though, because you were alluding to something earlier on about how these incentives fail in some ways because, for example, when you do move out to these more rural areas, you're going to need a whole new list of things that you'll have to pay for, not least a car. They don't have that kind of public transportation infrastructure in these rural areas. Is that something that's being missed? Is that another easy incentive that they could give? Subsidized cars, for example, maybe make fuel less expensive. Would that be an easy ask if they want to lure more people out of the cities?
Yeah, I think some towns already have already started doing so, offering cars free of charge for people who are interested in doing tameshi juntaku, so tameshi iju. So it's a kind of day trip or very short trip to check out a town with the potential of perhaps moving there later. But just if I may, going back to the singles, I think that it's a really interesting group to target for towns in the future because the rate of singles in Japan is rapidly rising. And I think quite a few of single women also, for example, mid-age, have started using entrepreneurial funding offered by the government. So there is actually quite a considerable number of single individuals who have moved with entrepreneurial activities. So I think this is definitely an aspect that will also continue to be relevant in the future.
Let me ask Hanako, we're down to our last few minutes. I mean, are you optimistic about where this is going?
In terms of this one-time payment, not necessarily. I think it would take a lot more money, a lot more one-time payments to encourage families to move into suburban or more rural areas in Japan. But with that being said, the government is continuing to recognize that depopulation in Japan is a huge, huge problem. I think by the end of March, the government plans to release a new plan where it would discuss increasing Japan's birth rate more seriously, right? It plans to propose different ways to improve childcare, maternity, paternity leave. There are so many different ways that Japan can provide support. Thematically speaking, right, Japan has been criticized in the past for its work culture, the lack of work-life balance, and forcing people to work very, very long hours. So if that issue is resolved for some people, that can also alleviate a lot of concerns. And of course, childcare costs, right? Nurseries are also facing staff shortages, and it's difficult for families to bring their children to these nurseries because there's also just simply not enough room. So it's a multi-thronged problem. And I think if the Japanese government continues to address each of these issues holistically, but also individually.
Hanako Montgomery, that will have to be the final word. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists really so much for being with us on this edition of The Newsmakers. Greatly appreciated. And our viewers, of course, for being with us as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter. And do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.